Hi and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast. I am very excited to introduce the last guest, the last interview of this year and this Urbcast podcast in English. And today we will talk about economics and we will talk about the influence of investments in urban infrastructure and not only, and how it makes more sense to invest in something like, for example, climate adaptation and climate resilience versus to do nothing, try to save money. And then when a cloudburst happens, like it did in Copenhagen in 2011, the damage is extremely big that it actually makes sense to avoid such a big burden for the city. We will talk also about my guest's take on housing affordability, one of the big challenges across the world, across European cities, including Copenhagen, as well as infrastructure as value creator, and can performance and cities' competitiveness be measured beyond GDP? And that's definitely a very interesting question to ask to economists. And my guest today is Sanni Nørgaard Breining, who is the Chief Economist and Director of Sustainable Economics at Ramboll Management Consulting. She specializes in applied econometrics as well as the economics of sustainable decision-making, also in our cities. Sanni also contributed to a paper, a research that we created together with urban partners Ramboll and BlocksHub. I was one of the co-authors of the report, which you will also find in the episode description. It was called The Copenhagen Way. Welcome to the last episode of the season with Sanni. Sanni, I just wanted to say welcome to Urbcast.
Thank you.
I'm very glad that you are here because I would love to look at the cities with this financial lens. And you happen to be economist working here at Ramboll. So maybe first, I would actually love to understand what made you choose this career, this path, this topic, economy, and now working with city advising as well.
Hard question to reflect on, sort of all those choices, because often I think your career path happens by coincidence. But I think I've always been really curious and engaged in the way societies work and the way people thrive, meet each other, create value by interacting. And I think that's throughout my sort of youth and adulthood has been sort of something I've been very curious about. And then more or less by coincidence, I ended up studying economics and thinking I want to be a big boss of a big company at some point. But then during my studies, I realized that national economy is super interesting, understanding GDP growth, understanding the mechanisms behind and the fact that you can measure so much with data and statistics. You can uncover untold stories by using data and statistics. And I just found that a super sort of powerful tool for substantiating storytelling. So that was sort of a path I pursued, and also did research. I have a PhD in economics, so sort of pursued that path, deep diving into data and just really geeking out on economics until I arrived at Ramboll as a senior consultant 9 years ago. And that sort of, again, broadened the perspective of what can an engineering company as Ramboll actually do, and the important role that a company like Ramboll actually plays in developing societies and defining futures of cities and countries.
What were your main research topics? Because you spent many years in academia before joining Ramboll.
Yeah.
What were some of your main topics and main discoveries along the way?
So it was actually quite different from, well, in some way quite different from what I do today, but it was very much about sort of identifying the long-run impacts of different situations. So, for example, health outcomes. If your family is hit by a health incident, you have a diagnosis, or children get sick, or you have your child too early, so it's very low birth weight, and so on. What is actually the long-run consequences of both the individual and the families? Sort of looking a lot on sort of those more sort of soft welfare-oriented topics, but with an economic focus. And all along, the focus was to measure impact and measure how does this affect in the individual and the society. So that was sort of the main findings. And I think, or the main focus areas. And I think the findings all along was sort of the importance of long-run investments and the importance of not just looking at the outcomes that are right in front of you, but really looking at the long-run outcomes and taking that into account when making your decisions, whether it's policy decisions or investment decisions. And that really links to what I'm doing now.
Exactly. This is something that you've also shared in the work we've done together in the Copenhagen Way publication. And there we focus on the climate adaptation. And I remember this argument you made that there's like a big hidden cost of not acting, and definitely investing and looking into the future is something that will prevent a lot of costs. Eventually, it also will bring a lot of value in different ways. How do you make this argument happen in reality? How would you talk to the decision makers and clients from like Ramboll perspective? It is worth it to make this long-term investment in city infrastructure instead of ignoring the problem and not investing.
That is a big challenge because all of these investments that we see, that we sort of harvest the value of in a very long run perspective, if it's more than sort of 5 years or 4 years, then it becomes sort of very unconcrete in a way. So that is a challenge. How can we actually prioritize and make our investments valuable, even though the return might arrive in the far future? So I think what I always return to is sort of showing it by with data, basically. So if we can show a credible story that making these investments are actually worth it, then that will always be sort of my starting point in dialogues. And that helps also in terms of keeping ourselves committed to those choices, those long-run choices, because what we often see is that those sort of long-run the investments that you see the outcome of in the long run, those are the ones that are easy to discard at some point because you can save a bit of your investment by not doing that, but the consequences then hitting you in the long run. So if we can show that is really actually a bad decision to not stick with your initial thinking, then that helps. We actually did some sort of quick study, but looking at some of the investments in urban resilience. So looking at different European cities, like basically all European cities, looking at them in terms of their how we sort of created an overall urban resilience score on different parameters to see how is the connection between city GDP growth and sort of having invested in urban resilience, basically, or at least scoring high on an urban resiliency score. And there we saw a very clear relationship between having good sort of urban resiliency, scoring high on that, and GDP growth. I think that is sort of, from a macro perspective at least, and good evidence that it is worthwhile, both as a public entity, but also as an investor to focus on these elements because there is a return.
Is that visible in Copenhagen as well? I especially wanted to bring this example, which I use a lot, which is the flooding, the cloudburst in Copenhagen in 2011. It is beyond the scale, the damage that the cloudburst caused back then in Denmark. It is estimated that it was about 6 billion Danish crowns, which is over 700 million euro in damage, which basically could have been prevented, right?
So if you just balance that towards the investments that you could have made to prevent it, without having done those calculations, I'm sure that the investments would have been lower than the costs of the incidents actually happening. But that's where we're sort of challenged in the way our mindsets and our economic models work, that we're not classically taking into account sort of those costs that might happen in the future. And it's hard to sort of internalize that in the models. So that is definitely something to be aware of, because and today more than ever, how we sort of take account of these avoidable cost and make those investments. And again, of course, we are living in a society with scarce resources, and we have to prioritize. And that's, again, like, maybe I'm sort of very, very economist focused on data and calculations. But again, here it comes into fact that if we have better data and we have better analysis to back up our decisions, then we can use that to prioritize where do we want to do these investments, what is most important for us to avoid, to make sure that we have thriving cities and thriving urban areas.
Speaking of priorities, I feel like when following the dialogue in European cities, but especially in Copenhagen, where we both live, I feel like there's obviously still the discussion about climate, but less lately because of another huge crisis, which is housing, affordable housing crisis. And obviously, we could create another episode solely on the affordable housing challenge. But what would be your take? So, speaking of the growth of cities and growth of Copenhagen paradox, which is, the city attracts a lot of talents, and the city infrastructure, the housing, cannot keep up with the inflow of people who really would like to live somewhere centrally in Copenhagen, of course. What's your take on this? Is there any ways we could decrease the crisis and meet the demand a bit better? It's probably like $1 million question, but
Yes.
But you as an economist, how do you see that?
Yeah, I wish I had a very clear answer. Then I would go out
and scream, go to the city hall.
Exactly. This is what we need to do, and go to every city, because I think this is not a Copenhagen-specific problem. It's very much sort of a thriving city paradox in a way. When we see sort of livability-driven growth, when that works, it is often accompanied by sort of the erosion of affordability. And that is just a huge challenge. In my mind, you need to realize that we can't sort of design our way out of sort of a housing crisis, but we need to build our way out of it, basically. So we need to add the affordability options in the way we design the cities, while, of course, keeping livability at the core. And I think that's where we also begin to see some of the great examples of sort of mixed areas, where we have, affordability, but we also have rental housing, the way we want to move, so that we not only sort of quality improving, because when we quality improve, the willingness to pay increase, and that's good for as an investor. But in the long run, it will be hard for a city not having affordable housing. That's all, like, everyone realizes that. Then the people we need to take care of our children, the teachers, the nurses, and so on, like, they can't afford to live in the city, and then they're pushed further out, and pendling distances can't be too long. So in reality, we end up having a city without the essential people that we need to actually have a thriving city. So there is, of course, sort of, how do we avoid that a city sort of get killed in its own success in a way?
In Copenhagen, still, it might be better of a situation than, for example, in London, or I guess in some American cities where the distances get extremely, extremely long. If you commute 2 hours one way to work, it's really affecting your health, your life quality a lot, right? So I was wondering, there are people, obviously, the property owners that are hoping that the increase will go forever. Yes. There is definitely this challenge of mix and of having the opportunity hopefully more equal opportunities for different people to live in the city and contribute to the city, and also take from the city as well.
For sure. And I think that's also a question of who invests in what and who gets the return on which investments. So from sort of a more public side, then we need to make sure that our cities are affordable. Can we ask investors to take part of that responsibility? Yes, maybe, especially if we can show that there's actually a good return on your investment if you create mixed areas. And I think we can. I think we have examples of that. As a municipality or a government, you are also interested in creating sort of equal opportunities and not having cities that are exclusively for a particular part of your population. There is a limit to how long you can actually pendle or sort of commute to your workplace without it actually having bad effects on your well-being.
Speaking of investments, I think it's sometimes hard to follow the money and how to follow the effect of an investment. I think that you even mentioned that in the report we did, that sometimes you don't know, or like when you improve a situation in a city and city is providing a healthier life for a citizen, then the cost of health-related services is decreased on a national level. But this is the city that made the investment, not the national government.
Yes.
So in that sense, it's hard to track where the money was invested and where the outcome went.
Who's making the investment and who's getting the return? That's not always the same individuals. And that can sometimes be a barrier for making the right choices, because being paid out of my box, but I'm not getting the return. So why should I actually make this investment? And I think that is going back to sort of climate investments as well. That is part of sort of the big challenges we have there. Who's actually going to make those investments to protect our cities and protect the big investments we have there in terms of essential services, infrastructure, and buildings, and so on. There's definitely a need for us to improve the way we follow the investments and the returns. And I think that's also mentioned in the Copenhagen Way report, that the private-public partnership is sort of essential for that. But to make that really work, we need to be able to, again, the economist speaking, we need to be able to measure it and show it in the data and our expectations, sort of in terms of who should invest and who will get the returns. And when that's not sort of necessarily the same people, well, then we have seen in other areas that we make constructions around sort of the returns, so it becomes more fair and the incentives are better in actually making those investments, even though the return is not directly coming into your.
How can this be done? Meaning here infrastructure as a value creator. And by infrastructure, we can mean housing. We also advocate for treating housing as infrastructure. There is mobility infrastructure like metro, like buses and so on. How can cities measure this long-term value, not just the cost of sustainable infrastructure?
There's different ways of measuring that. One part would, of course, sort of, again, let me rewind. How we measure it depends a bit on who the recipient is. So if we're seeing it from a societal perspective, then we would like to look at the sort of the broad socioeconomic impact of it. And that could be looking at sort of GDP growth. Are we, with these investments, are we actually seeing a return in terms of GDP? Are we seeing our communities and our citizens becoming healthier, richer? Do we see more job creation and all of these sort of elements that we would classically look at from sort of a societal perspective? And I think what is interesting and what we've sort of seen in some studies now is also that these elements like thriving communities, thriving population, a healthy population, people at work, and so on, that is actually really well linked to the return on investment from a private side. whether that answers your question. It depends a bit on who we're looking at, how we should sort of measure that. But I think the end goal is more aligned than we might think.
I would definitely dwell even more a bit in that, and especially into the metrics, because you've mentioned the GDP growth. And as we discussed, you've listened to some of the previous episodes of this podcast, and lately I have been talking about playgrounds and play, and how can we integrate that into our cities, our districts. And my guests, both they said about play as an instrument, play as sustainability integration, and especially in the last one about the role of playgrounds and how could Europe use playgrounds to its strength. We also discussed comparing how Europe is doing, not in terms of GDP, but in terms of, for example, safety, the quality of life, and so on, and when we might lag if it comes to production and financial terms, numeric terms, compared to, for example, US or China, shouldn't we consider other metrics? And this is a perfect question for you as an economist and someone who works with sustainable economies. Yes, is that time that we start discussing something more than only the financial metrics and the GDP growth?
For sure. I definitely think it is. Like the whole sort of well-being economics, like thinking of other returns than just inevitable GDP growth. That's also sort of part of the donut economics sort of thinking and the whole sort of new economic thinking wave we've seen over the last couple of years. We're really advocating that GDP is not the only sovereign sort of measure that we should be using. We should be looking at equality. We should be looking at, like we've done that for years, like with Gini coefficients and so on. But that should be part of it. We should be able to turn the value of well-being into something we prioritize from. Like Bhutan is the classical example that they're actually not just looking at GDP, but they're looking at well-being as sort of a main parameter for growth. So, of course, that is also another country that is maybe not comparable to a lot of the European countries, but that is quite interesting, sort of shifting that mindset, really thinking about the social value creation as a driver of thriving countries and thriving cities. I think at one point I was very much in an area where I was thinking we just need to monetize the value of well-being and use that as our main prioritization sort of mechanism. But I think over the last couple of years, I've sort of backed a bit down from that. I still think that is super, super important. But for this to actually make a difference for us, to actually change the way we think, we do need to link this to the investment side, to the financial side. It is hard, both for public and private entities, to prioritize for something that is monetized. It might be quantified and you might monetize it, but you can't capitalize it. And that is sort of a really important difference. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look at it, because I definitely think that is all of those social and sustainable dimensions are part of our capitalizable return. And we actually showed that in some of the work we did where we looked at placemaking and the value of placemaking.
This is something I really wanted to ask about, because when you've been discussing about creating the social value and something that is sometimes hard to measure right on spot, then I thought about placemaking, creating a place, creating a community around something that might have also some sort of financial gains in the future, but you might not know exactly when.
Exactly. And I think that also links very well to the playgrounds and all of that. So I think our idea with that project was you feel when you're in a great place. Like you can feel it. You can't necessarily describe it, but you know that there's just places where you want to stay. You want to have that glass of wine after work. You want to just stay on the bench and talk to the people you meet. And then there are other places where you just don't get that vibe. You just want to get out of there and do your stuff and then move on. So we were really curious about that, like what makes that difference, and is it actually something that we can quantify, monetize, and see a capitalizable sort of value of. We did a project where we tried to conceptualize good placemaking, looking at sort of the grand old man, Jan Gehl, and his criteria for what is could be perceived as a good place. And then we tried to quantify that, make it into something quantifiable, and did a lot of sort of surveys to get knowledge of people's sort of how they perceive their own part of the city. Again, focused on Copenhagen. And then we linked that to housing prices, and we linked it to loneliness and other drivers. And it was really clear that the areas where people that score high on the placemaking score, so where people thrive and feel comfortable, have a good vibe, we translate it into, there the house pricing are higher. We see lower perceived loneliness as well. So that was really clear links that if you create sort of that vibe, invest a bit more perhaps and create the good vibes, then there is actually a very tangible return on that. And then, of course, we get back to are we then eroding the opportunities for everyone to live in the city because we're just pushing up house pricing? So
exactly that. I wanted to be the devil's advocate here and say that what about the gentrification and the potential displacement even? Because that's something that comes on the back of a successful project, of a successful placemaking often, that people start going there. People, I think in Copenhagen, we could talk about the example of the big food hall called the Papirøen, and then it was turned into housing in a very, very prominent location. It has some social housing, like affordable housing in there, from what I remember. But still, that's obviously like such a valuable piece of land in the city that obviously it's also driven by higher prices. That's the complexity of a city, right? And this is why I also wanted to talk to you as someone who works with financial and not only, but more economical lens on the cities. Probably it's hard to answer whether you could have a thriving city, a thriving places in cities, boosted by placemaking, but at the same time preserve it for everyone. What are your thoughts around that?
I'm always hesitant to say something if I don't have the data and the evidence. But you're really pushing me out on sort of thin ice here. But if I'm going with gut feeling, I would say this, and it's not just gut feeling. I think there's some logic in thinking that we need the diversity in our cities for them to stay attractive. We need different people living side by side if we want the society that we sort of in Europe and in the Nordics we've been proud of, and that level of trust that we are sort of telling the world that we have, and all of that. I think that comes from us being mixed. So yes, I'm convinced that building sort of mixed neighborhoods and making sure that there is affordability in our cities is key for keeping sort of driving prosperous and resilient cities, basically. I'm hoping that we will get the opportunity to actually get some evidence behind that. So it's not just our gut feelings and what we all sort of expect to see, but that we can actually prove that by showing it in data and analysis. Then we can do a new podcast where I prove that.
So I'm looking forward to see some numbers as well. So this is, I guess, something that you are working on.
I'm working, so that is sort of the I'm not a researcher anymore, so now I'm a consultant. So we're looking forward to get some funding and actually doing this, because this would be something that would be really relevant for a lot of different actors in society. So that could be an advertisement for reaching out.
That's first. That's an ad, and then secondly, that's the teaser of a potentially another very interesting topic and a study. And speaking of some of the other challenges in the cities, I think that obviously we are living in more uncertain times than we used to here in Europe some years ago. But I wonder if you have any other challenges that you see in your work with cities that also might be worth to discuss.
One of the biggest challenges we see in the cities is that the cities need to, they're basically responsible for so many things. We've already been touched upon a lot of it. But again, that's also why cities are so interesting and so important. Like the responsibility of being robust in terms of climate, also being robust against other types of threats that might come from the outside. That's also the responsibility to some extent of a city. And the city also needs to make sure that we can get our children safely to school, that they can get a good education, that we have their housing, that we have hospitals, that we have daycare centers, and so on. So I think the biggest challenges right now is going back to scarce resources. How do we make all of these investments that we need to make to ensure that we keep our children happy and safe, that we keep our young people well educated and with equal opportunities, that we are resilient against climate changes and other geopolitical pressures. I think it's the main challenge is competing pressures and how do we prioritize what is most important today and not forgetting the long run.
And your solution would be data, data, and data.
Yeah, maybe you need someone to broaden that perspective. But to some extent, I realize data can't solve all of the world's problems, but knowledge might help.
So at least to start with data.
Start with evidence. Like let us create let's make sure that we are making evidence-based decisions and not just sort of gut-feeling investments or priorities because we're scared or because we are pressured. Breathe in and make evidence-based decisions. That will help us in the long run. I think that would be sort of the economist's perspective on it.
That's a strong call to action. That's a quote I'm going to use when publishing this episode. And coming towards the end, I also would like to ask you for some recommendations, because definitely we can add links to the reports we've mentioned, including the placemaking report. But beyond that, would you also have something that you would recommend to better understand sustainable economic decision-making in cities? A book, maybe?
Yeah. So, of course, I was going to recommend the Copenhagen Way because I think it is a good Christmas read. But a book I was thinking of is by Jane Jacobs, which is called Cities and the Wealth of Nations. So it's a really old book. Realizing I'm saying it's a really old book. It's from 1984, which is my birth year, so not that old, but older, not newly published at least. It's sort of the core idea of the book is that cities and not nations are really sort of the economic drivers. They are driving the economic growth. So she really early on sort of spots this fact and explains it really well. It's very intuitively described in this book, sort of mentioning innovation, diversity, and interactions already in the 80s. And I think that is quite cool. And it's not a super technical economic sort of book, but it hints towards sort of the economic dynamics, which I find interesting.
And she wasn't an economist herself either. She wasn't an urbanist, like by education as well. So that's even more interesting that she coined so many rules that we follow right now
today,
when looking at cities.
Exactly. That's
very powerful. Sanni, thank you so much for sharing your enthusiasm with me and the listeners while talking about the economics in cities. And I know that definitely we could have covered even more topics, but you also have some studies to to make, and then we definitely can meet for another round and explore some of the topics further, because definitely sustainable economics, this is something that runs the cities we live in and should have a lot of attention.
Well, thank you for having me and letting me ramble along these lines. I am super enthusiastic about this topic. And yes, there are so many things that we could look at and through an economic lens challenge the way we think. So yeah, but thank you.
And that's it for today. For the latest episode of this year and this season of Urbcast. Thank you very much for listening. And I will be back in 26 with some new ideas, probably a bit of a new format as well. So yeah, thanks a lot for listening to this episode as well as the previous episodes of Urbcast. If you have any suggestions for the guests or any other things, any other thoughts, feel free to reach out to me either on Instagram, Facebook or LinkedIn, or on my email info@urbcast.pl. One more time, thanks a lot, and I will talk to you soon in 2026.